Hello everybody. I hope everybody has been doing great. Learning during this difficult times is not easy. So let's begin our lecture on pulmonary function tests. Pulmonary function tests, as the name suggests, are tests that are performed to review the functioning of the lung. Before we start the class, let us look at the learning outcomes. At the end of this lecture, the learner will be able to enlist types of pulmonary function tests and describe various lung volumes and lung capacities. So before we progress, let us take a moment to recap. Before we start talking, let us recollect what are the parts of the lung and how gas exchange happens. Do note down all that you recall about the functioning of the lung. I know it's been quite some time since you studied anatomy, but do take your time, recall about the function of the lung. Pause this video, note down everything that you remember onto a piece of paper or on your notebook, and then start playing this video. Okay, so now let us look at the lung. As you know, the lung is a very important excretory organ in your body. It excretes carbon dioxide and also a lot of other volatile substances like alcohol from your body. Now, if you look at the lungs, there is one pair of lungs. So there is your left lung and the right lung. The left lung is divided into two lobes. It is divided into the superior lobe and the inferior lobe, whereas the right lung is divided into three lobes: the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. Now, air enters into the respiratory system through the nose or through the mouth, and it enters through the trachea. It comes through the trachea, and the trachea then divides itself into two bronchi. The bronchi then further subdivides into bronchioles and later into alveolus. It is the air exchange happens in the alveolus, as you may be aware. So now let us look at how air exchange happens in the alveolus. Now, assuming this is the alveolus, these small bubbles or the small grape-like thing that you see is the air sacs, or as it is mentioned here, it is the alveolar sac. Now, each alveolar sac is covered by blood vessels. So, deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body will come to the lungs by the pulmonary artery, and the gases are exchanged. That is, the carbon dioxide is exchanged for oxygen, and oxygenated blood will exit the lungs through the pulmonary vein. Now, let us briefly look at how this process happens. Now, let us assume this as the alveoli. So, it is a circular sac, and the blood vessel flows around the circular sac. So, as you can see, deoxygenated blood is signified by the blue color. So it comes in, the deoxygenated blood enters through the capillary, and it exits as the oxygenated blood, which is signified in red color. Now air enters into the alveoli, so there is more concentration of oxygen in the air that enters into the alveoli, and the oxygen is then entered into blood, and the carbon dioxide which is present in blood will enter into the alveoli. So this exchange takes place, and carbon dioxide will exit from the alveoli, or air containing more amount of carbon dioxide will exit from the alveoli. This is how the air exchange process generally takes place. Now there are two components here, or two rate limiting factors here. One is called perfusion. Perfusion is the amount of blood that reaches the alveoli, and the other one is called as ventilation. Ventilation is basically the amount of air that enters into the alveoli. If these two rate limiting factors are controlled or kept under control, only then the air exchange process will take place at its full efficiency. If there is reduced perfusion, or if there is reduced ventilation, what will happen is the body will not require sufficient amount of oxygen, and the opposite, that is, when there is less perfusion but normal ventilation, or when there is more perfusion but reduced ventilation also, gas exchange will not take place normally. So let us look at the different tests for lung function. The test for lung function can be broadly divided into four types. So first one is the test that measure the lung volume. Second one is called as spirometry. Basically, spirometry tests will measure the lung capacities. And then you have arterial blood gases, which is basically done by taking blood from the arteries, which will measure for concentration of different ions and gases in the blood. And then there is exercise testing. The first two are direct tests of the lung function, which will basically measure the ventilation, whereas the remaining two will check the amount of oxygen that is available in the blood. So you can say that the remaining two might probably look for the perfusion aspect as well. Now, lung volume test is the most important one among this. Now, most commonly used methods for lung volumes, first one is called as body plethysmography, which you can see on the image on the left side. So, basically, the gentleman in the image is sitting inside a chamber. His nose is blocked and he has to blow into the mouthpiece. Now, basically, when he inhales and exhales, the device will monitor the amount of air that passes through the receptors and will measure his lung volumes. When his body moves, that is when he breathes or when he inhales or exhales out, based on the movement of the chest wall, there will be changes in air pressure inside the chamber. So, using these two, they will be able to measure the lung volumes. And then there are imaging methods like chest x-rays or CT scans. There are high definition CT scans which can be used to measure the size and shape of the lungs. Chest x-rays will basically show any obstructions that are present in the lungs, like because of infections or inflammations. Gas dilution is another method which basically measures the amount of gas that can dilute into the blood, which is beyond the scope of this discussion. Now we'll quickly go through the different types of lung volumes. Now assume this is a graph that is plotted as volume versus time when you are inhaling or exhaling out. The peaks or the troughs are your inhalations or exhalations. Now this is called as a tidal volume or TV. Now, when you have to breathe in with full pressure, that is, say for example, a voluntary breathing, that is, you voluntarily try to breathe entirely, or like say for example during exercises or during exertion, what happens is the chest will expand to its maximum capacity and will give a peak like this. This peak or this entire thing is called as the inspiratory reserve volume. Now, when you exhale out or when you try to exhale out fully, like say for example as part of exercise or as part of exertion, they'll show a trough like this, the green trough that you see. This is called as the expiratory reserve volume. Some amount of air will continue to remain in the lungs. They cannot be exhaled out completely, and that extra volume is called as the residual volume. And the total of all this, that is the inspiratory reserve volume plus tidal volume plus expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume, is called as total lung capacity. This is the total amount of air that can be held by the lungs. Now we'll look at different types of lung capacities. Again, this is the same graph that I had shown in the previous slide, but in this graph I've included both the active inhalation and active exhalation as well. So as we saw in the previous slides, the breathing, the amount of air that is breathed in or out during the resting phase or during passive respiration is called as tidal volume. And when you have an active inhalation process, that amount of air that is inhaled in is called as the inspiratory reserve volume, and the amount of air that is exhaled out during an active respiration process is called as the expiratory reserve volume. And then you have the residual volume, which is the amount of air, which is the capacity of air that remains in the lungs after exhalation. This is the extra volume that is available in the lungs. Now let us look at capacities. If you take a total of the inspiratory reserve volume and tidal volume, it is called as inspiratory capacity. This is the total capacity of air that can be inhaled by a lung when you try to your best. That is, when you try to inhale completely, this is the maximum amount of air that can be held by the lungs. As you may be aware, capacity is the amount of substance that can be held by a container or by a space. So assuming that your lung is a container, so inspiratory capacity basically refers to the maximum amount of air that can be inspired by your lung when you do an active respiration process. Now let us look at functional reserve capacity. Functional reserve capacity is a summation of expiratory reserve volume and residual volume. Now, functional reserve capacity is the capacity of lungs, is the total capacity of lungs that it can put to use whenever required. Like say, for example, expiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that is, as you know, is the amount of air that is exhaled by the body during an active process of exhalation. Some amount of air remains in the lungs. Now, total of these two is called as functional reserve capacity. So, when you have an urgent need or when you have requirement for extra breathing effort, this much amount of capacity can be put by the lungs extra. Now, when you total the inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume, it comes to a capacity called as vital capacity. Vital capacity is the amount of air that can be held by your lungs in a normal situation. So, this is the total capacity or total amount of air that can be held by the lungs when you breathe completely in and breathe completely out. Now, vital capacity is a very important component, because vital capacity basically is the amount of air, that amount or capacity that your lung has to breathe properly. Now, as we discussed in the previous slide, the total of all the four volumes, that is inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, and residual volume, put together is called as total lung capacity. So these are the four different types of capacity. So there is an inspiratory capacity, there is vital capacity, there is functional reserve capacity, and then there is total lung capacity. So to summarize what we discussed in today's presentation, now lung function tests can be used to measure volumes and capacities of the lungs. Like I said, it can also be used to measure the exchange of gases. Like say, for example, using arterial blood gases. Lung volumes are usually measured using plethysmography or X-rays. Lung capacity changes are very important to determine functioning of the lung in disease states. So when you have a disease of the lung, it is very important to measure the lung capacity changes. Like say, for example, if you have a obstructive disease like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, what will happen is the lung capacity will be reduced. Similarly, if you have any other disease condition like say, for example, emphysema or any tumors, the capacity of the lungs will be reduced. So lung capacity changes are very important to measure the progress or changes in the lung during such diseases. Now, lung capacity can be measured before starting therapy, and they can be remeasured after starting therapy to see how much change in the lung capacity is seen as a result of drug. We'll be discussing more about this in the forthcoming classes. Thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.